Good morning, guys and girls. Jake Arthur here with you, answering your Colts fantasy football and NFL draft questions. The draft was held since the last time we did this, so we've got quite a bit to cover today. First up is from Luke Dunleavy on Twitter. He said, I'd like to hear about how Frank Reich is going to work Andrew Luck back into the offense in September after his year off. Fewer throws, more runs, plays designed to minimize quarterback contact, or do you just put him in there and let him go? Because he did have 39 throws per game in 2014 before he got hurt. I would imagine if Andrew Luck's goal comes true of being ready to go by training camp, then by September, he should be ready to go and just be his normal self. I'm obviously not a doctor. I just sit here in a computer chair for a living, but I would imagine, training camp starts around mid to late July, and if he is full go from there, the season starts in early to mid September. I can imagine he would be ready to just be his normal self that whole time. So part of the interesting thing to watch also will be, though, this is a new coaching staff. So we won't really know how much of it is just Frank Reich's actual game plan and scheme and design, and how much of it might be trying to minimize contact on Luck. We already know that even though they've built up the offensive line this offseason, that Reich wants to get the ball out quicker. So it's going to be hard for me to imagine we don't see improvements in that area. But we may never know how much of it is because of Luck's health or how much of it was just original plan. I guess if we see Jacoby Brissett in there, we might know a little better. Next up is from Football and Other F Words on Twitter. Who will score more fantasy points this year? Andrew Luck, Jacoby Brissett, or Blake Bortles? Since I believe Andrew Luck is going to play this year, I'm going to go in that direction. That automatically disqualifies Jacoby Brissett from the conversation. Even if, let's say, Luck doesn't play week one, I still think he plays more than Brissett this year. As far as Blake Bortles goes, he's in an offense that features the run a little more, and that team doesn't want to be based around Blake Bortles. They want to emphasize the run and then use Blake to take advantage of things in the passing game that were set up by the run, which includes play action. Let's also not mention that, Luck is much better than both of those players. And we've seen him lead the league in touchdowns before. So if I had to choose between the three, I would go with Luck. Next is from Sam Groth on Twitter. A lot of people want to bring up the Miami game to forecast a real projection of how Quentin Nelson will do against a more athletic defensive line in the NFL. What are your thoughts on that, and does that game hold any weight in an argument against Nelson being NFL ready? To be honest with you, I think he's going to get his big tests much sooner than that. I believe that's Week 12, Colts and Dolphins. Week 1, he has the Bengals. That's Geno Atkins, very first game, Week 1. The Bengals also have Andrew Billings, Carl Lawson, Michael Johnson, and Carlos Dunlap. So that right there is a really good defensive front. There's also some others before they face the Dolphins. You've got the Eagles, who just won the Super Bowl. A big portion of that was because of their defensive line. That unrelenting line that just comes in waves. It never gets tired. And then you've also got the Texans with J.J. Watt. That one could be the biggest one if we see that J.J. is back to himself after the injuries he's had the last couple years. Then you've also got Jacksonville, who just ridiculously adds to their defensive line, and it never seems like it's going to be a weakness of theirs for the next several years. I don't think we could question Nelson's readiness based off of that. If we see him just consistently getting pushed around and beaten by quicker guys, then maybe. But he is a rookie. He's one of the more elite offensive linemen we've seen come out of the draft in a while. But he does deserve the benefit of the doubt of having some rookie moments. Just limiting those moments will be important. But I'm really not worried about him in that regard. Next up from Jesse Owens on Twitter. Tiny footballs, what are they and how can I throw them? Well, you'll have to ask Tom House and Adam Dedeaux. Jason there is referring to some of Andrew Luck's rehab work with smaller weighted balls, building up strength, things like that, if he didn't catch on to the joke. Next up is Sean Kerr on Twitter. Did we ever find out who the mystery player was that Ballard and company were so high on going into the draft? And do you think that they got drafted by the Colts last weekend? To answer the last part quickly, no, because I don't think there would have been any mystery about the Colts liking Quentin Nelson. It was the only pro day that Chris Ballard went to, and there really was no secret tying those two sides together throughout the whole draft process. The 8 premium players that they probably had on their board was probably some mixture of Saquon Barkley, Quentin Nelson, Bradley Chubb, Roquan Smith, Minkah Fitzpatrick, Derwin James, Denzel Ward, and either Tremaine Edmonds or Mike McGlinchey. Those were pretty much all of the first non-quarterbacks selected in the draft, and they all would fit what the Colts would be looking for. Next up, T-Bane25 on Twitter. Is there any way to chart offensive line scheme or overall talent of offenses of Peyton Manning versus Andrew Luck? I'm curious about how long each held the ball on average. I thought Peyton was harder to sack due to scheme differences, plus his reading ability. And then you've got Chuck Pagano being lesser than most coaches. That would take having film from both eras and a lot of patience. But I'm sure you could get something substantial out of that. Basically just have to pay attention to what the line is doing and what it looks like they're supposed to be doing, which includes the tight ends. Another one to look at would be what routes the wide receivers are running. If you want to get the ball out quickly, you're not going to have them running long developing routes. I do know that Peyton Manning's Colts, they did scheme to get the ball out quicker when they would face a defensive line that might be able to really give their offensive line trouble. I've been told that before. I wish we could say the same for Chuck Pagano's Colts with Andrew Luck, but it really honestly never seemed like they schemed for their upcoming opponent. It just seemed like they were like, let's try and do this week, and it didn't always work. Next up is also from T-Bane on Twitter. If you knew each pick of the 2018 draft, which picks would you do differently for the Colts? I'm a fan of the first couple rounds and optimistic about the rest. Just curious if you feel like there was better value and scheme fits at our spots. Well, overall, I'll just say that I really did like the Colts picks. There were several. They did take a few guys that were some of my favorite players in the draft, and everyone else, if I didn't know much about them or wasn't too much on board with it at the time, I've pretty much talked myself into it by now. I at least understand why they did everything that they did. But just to answer your question, and I'm not going to trash on any players or anything because they haven't played yet. They might wind up being really good. But there were some guys that they passed up that I thought they could have really used in some spots. Specifically in the second round, there were guys like Harold Landry, Darius Geis, Josh Jackson, and Isaiah Oliver all on the board that they passed. Sometimes multiple times with some of those guys, instead several picks in there. And then in the 7th round, there were guys that wound up being undrafted. Now, some of these guys went undrafted for a reason, whether it's character or injury, what have you. But you got Quentin Meeks, Desmond Harrison, Holton Hill were some of the major ones. Sky Moore was another one, but the Colts were actually able to get him as an undrafted free agent, so that I thought that was huge for them. Next, we've got from Sean Mescal on Twitter. Who do you think will start at the Mike and Sam linebacker positions in the Colts' new 4-3 defense next year? That one's kind of tough. I've been racking my brain just because there are different options for all of those. At Mike, I think they would prefer for Anthony Walker to take that spot. You know, they drafted him last year. He's a prototypical Mike, and he's a coach's son. That was one of his biggest positives going into the draft last year, was how smart of a player he was. So that would be great for him to take the Mike spot. If Walker or no one else really steps up to take it, then I think Najee Good kind of gets that spot by default. because he has experience doing it on a Super Bowl winning team. And I think the coaches would trust him a little more. At Sam, if Walker doesn't win the Mike job, then I would, look for him to be a candidate for Sam. But also Antonio Morrison. Chris Ballard has mentioned that the Sam will be their least used linebacker anyways, and while we all probably think Morrison is out the door, if they just view him as strictly a run defender and they don't need him to be very, mobile or rangy, then they may stick him at Sam just to solely defend the run. So I would look for Walker, Antonio Morrison, and rookie Matthew Adams as the top 3 candidates at Sam. Adams is a similar run defender to Antonio Morrison, but he is much more athletic. So if what the Colts have been doing our last year and a half is any indicator, I'd imagine Adams will be slotted over Morrison. But we have to see all this transpire in training camp. Next up, Texas Colts fan on Twitter. Why no love from the top undrafted free agents, especially at defensive back? Would have expected us to be a top destination to come and lock down a roster spot. Well, just as much as the Colts maybe didn't get any of those high-profile guys that I mentioned earlier, the Colts may not have also been interested in them either. So it's not necessarily that those players didn't choose the Colts. The Colts may not have gone after them. I think by the fact that they used 11 draft picks and not one of them was a defensive back, that it shows they really like the group of guys they already have. They spent those picks in the last draft on building that secondary, and it looks like they want to give those guys a chance to prove what they've got this year. The only defensive backs that they did pick up in this undrafted period were guys with upside who might provide depth and maybe knock some of the lower level depth chart guys off just to replace them and kind of add the competition of depth there as well as special teams. Next is Nathan Jenks on Twitter. If Jack Mewhort is healthy, why not play him at right guard and try Braden Smith at right tackle? Before this or after this question was asked, the Colts have since signed Austin Howard, and that was yesterday. I imagine Howard is going to be the starting right tackle, but just for the sake of argument here with this question, number one, it's hard to plan around Jack Mewhort because of his health, and with Braden Smith playing anything other than guard, I don't see that happening, at least not in their original plan, because one of the things they raved about him for was his ability to pull from the guard position. I think they just envision that interior line of Quentin Nelson, Ryan Kelly, and Braden Smith and all the things they'll be able to do with that. So I really don't think they want to screw with that plan much. Next up is from Roy Pickett on Facebook. He says, who starts on the defensive line at right tackle, at linebacker, at cornerback? Who are the 3 wide receivers other than T.Y. Hilton and Ryan Grant? And who will have the most rushing yards for the Colts this season? Okay, so obviously training camp can change everything, but my initial thoughts on all those are as follows. On the defensive line, I think we see Jabal Sheard and John Simon start at defensive end, with Danico Autry and Hassan Ridgeway at defensive tackle. Al Woods is obviously a candidate to stay starting on the defensive line. But he just doesn't fit the profile for what they're looking for, other than being a run defender. So it wouldn't surprise me if he remains the starter, but it just doesn't fit with what they've been doing as far as trying to get faster and more athletic. Austin Howard, already mentioned, I think would start at right tackle. Linebackers, just gun to my head, I'm going to say Najee Good at Mike, Darius Leonard at Will, and Anthony Walker at Sam. Cornerback, Quincy Wilson at right cornerback, Pierre Desir at left cornerback, and Nate Hairston in the nickel. At wide receiver, you mentioned outside of T.Y. Hilton and Ryan Grant. I think we see Chester Rogers finally get to show his stuff if he stays healthy. I'm telling you guys, last year in training camp, he looked outstanding. The hamstring injury ruined everything. I think he was going to be on his way to having a really good season, whether or not Andrew Luck was there. So if Rodgers can stay healthy this summer and Andrew Luck is back, that is going to be something to really watch for. Okay, so Hilton, Rogers, Grant. I also think both rookies, Deion Kane and Doris Fountain, make the roster. Both draft picks, both with really high upside. I don't think there's any chance that either of those guys make it to the practice squad if the Colts waive them, so I think they're going to hold on to both. If the Colts decide to keep 6 wide receivers on the roster this year, then I would expect that to be between KJ Brent, Krishawn Hogan, and rookie undrafted Steve Ishmael. And then the last portion of that question, I think Marlon Mack leads the Colts in rushing this year. But because it's more of a running back by committee, I do not think that he'll reach 1,000 yards. There's a big chance that Jordan Wilkins, if you've been following along the past couple of days on Stampede Blue, Jordan Wilkins could, claim the starting spot. Nyheim Hines is going to be really involved, as will Robert Turbin probably. So while we'll see someone obviously lead the backfield, I don't think we're going to see the leader get to 1,000 yards. And then our last question today is John Simon a defensive end or linebacker? Recently, Chris Ballard declared that Simon was going to be a right defensive end for them. I thought it was going to make total sense for him to be the Sam linebacker. He was a playmaker out in space last year, especially in the preseason from a linebacker spot. I thought that was going to really fit well with this new defense. But it looks like they think that he's going to have a better chance of reaching his peak if he's in a 3-point stance rushing the quarterback. That doesn't mean we won't necessarily see him occasionally in a linebacker spot, but that's not going to be his home position. Well, guys, that is it for this week. We'll do it again soon, probably here within the next couple weeks. We've got rookie mini camps starting this weekend, and then there's going to be more mini camps and things like that occurring. So follow along on StampedeBlue.com as well as on Twitter and Facebook at Jake Arthur NFL. Thanks, guys.